What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into a couple more budget decks that I kind of came up with for MTG Arena's Explorer format. The idea of these decks, they're kind of focused around the Explorer format, but kind of like an entry point if you're looking to play some sort of competitive deck in the near future in the Explorer format as we kind of go into that dry season of Standard, as we don't have a new release for the set until September. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just talk about them. So the first deck up here on the list is going to be a Delver of Secrets, kind of Izzet Spells sort of deck. The one key thing with the decks that I'm kind of going over today, a lot of them on the budget side are really low to the ground, as they don't require a ton of mana to really get going. And this is kind of one of those key decks that kind of do that. It is Izzet Spells. It focuses around a lot of cheap creatures that benefit from us playing a lot of cheap spells and try to get extra value out of said spells. A couple of key cards in the deck that stand out, as I do have a couple extra rares in the deck, as I do think it takes a little bit extra rares to kind of get a budget deck going. A lot of the decks, you'll notice that I do have 4 copies of Shocklands. These are kind of like really key lands if you were to build a dual color deck in Explorer format. These are kind of like the primary land that you see like in most decks in Explorer. And I do think these are kind of like lands you want to craft if you do decide to explore this format. Another card that works for this deck is Dreadhorde Arcanist. It's a 2-mana 1/3 with trample, and whenever it attacks, we can cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value then less than or equal to it, and then we can play it from our graveyard while paying its mana cost, and then after we cast it that second time, it'll get exiled instead. And itself also has trample, which is definitely pretty good there. Another key card in the deck that helps out is we do have the Sprite Dragon. It's a 2-mana 1/1. I just had the alternate art on because it just was on by default when I added it in. But it's a 2-mana Sprite Dragon that's a 1/1 haster with flying. But whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Sprite Dragon. So in itself, it does get pretty big pretty quickly if our opponent doesn't deal with it. Other than that, we have get to a Lava Runner, 1-mana 1/2, and then if there are 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in our graveyard, it gets +1/+0 and haste. Delver of Secrets is also the other card that really makes the cut, that kind of helps this deck out. 1-mana 1/1. If we reveal the top card of our library and it's an instant or sorcery spell, we get to flip it into its 3/2 side. That's really all this deck has as for creatures. It's a very low to the ground, like I said, creature deck. When it comes to spells, we have things like Consider. We get to look at the top card of our library. We put that card into our graveyard, and then we draw a card. So it's like Scry, and then draw the card that either you draw a card at random or you scry the card into your graveyard, or you keep the card on top and then draw it. You have Fate and Hope for a little bit of a bounce. We have Opt as another great card. We can scry 1, which is kind of like Consider. It's a 1-mana, scry 1, and then we draw a card. But this one we don't have to throw in the graveyard. We can just throw it on the bottom of our library, and we get the draw effect at instant speed. We have Ancestral Anger. This is another cool card for the deck, as it kind of allows our cards to be a little bit more aggressive. It gives target creature trample, and it gets +X/+0, where X is 1 plus the number of cards named Ancestral Anger in our graveyard, and then we get to draw a card. So a little bit of that momentum, tempo-y style thing. And combine that with something like a Dreadhorde Arcanist, it kind of allows us to maybe cast it during our main phase, then attacking with a Dreadhorde Arcanist, then recast it, and maybe make Stora trigger twice, which is definitely very good there. We also have a couple copies of Play with Fire for that initial spot removal, or that maybe that 2 damage to finish off your opponent, or maybe remove a creature that's in your way. We have Reckless Rage. It's a 1-mana instant, which is definitely an interesting card in itself, because it is a 4 damage to target creature we don't control, and then we have to do 2 damage to target creature we do control. So it does have some sort of like limitations on what we can do with it. But overall, it's a very good removal for 1 mana. We get to do 4 damage, and we do have creatures in our deck that should have enough toughness that should be able to absorb that 2 damage, which is definitely very good there. Then in the last slot here, we have just a copy of Spikefield Hazard, as a way to maybe just ping our opponent for a point of damage or a creature they may control. Or we can play it as the flip side land. And then we also have 4 copies of Chart of Course, which is draw 2 cards and then discard a card unless we attack this turn. So this is just a bit of a way to dig a little bit deeper. This is kind of one of those things that I kind of added this here because I really wanted to put Expressive Iteration, but with that being banned, I felt like this was an okay replacement, maybe not as good, but definitely an okay replacement if we're trying to be a little bit aggressive with the aggro and attack. But though the 2 cards would have been more beneficial to us playing them during our upkeep rather than after our second. Not during our upkeep, sorry, during our first main phase, then into our second. But definitely still a good card that we can draw 2 for 2. So definitely good in that sense. And then our mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 21 lands, technically 22 if you include the Spikefield Hazard. We have 9 islands, 8 mountains, 4 steam vents. You can play the dual lands if you do have those from standard. Those are definitely very good. And work your way to get yourself a couple of steam vent, or get yourself a set of steam vents, which are eventually pretty good. You can also play pathways, which are also a possibility. You can also play the slow lands that we have currently in standard, which are the lands that come into battlefield tapped, unless you have 2 or more lands in the battlefield. And then in our sideboard, I do have some cards that you can look at upgrading if you want to go about that. Soul Scar Mage is definitely a good 1-drop. I'd probably replace the Get2 Lava Runner with this, as it is a 1-mana Prowess creature that's a 1/2. And Prowess is essentially an ability that whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we get to give this creature +1/+1 into end of turn, so it gets bigger and bigger the more non-creature spells we cast. Yet again, goes very well with the Dread Horde Arcanist, and then itself has another cool ability that if a sorcery we control will deal non-combat damage to a creature an opponent controls, we get to put that many -1/-1 counters on the creature instead. So kind of, if we can't technically kill the creature, we can at least put some -1/-1 counters, maybe to shrink the creature in the process. Another card we have in the sideboard here is Stormwing Entity. It's a 4-mana or 5-mana 3/3 that has the ability of casting 3 less if we cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn. Has flying, has prowess, just like the Soul Scar Mage, giving it the +1/+1 every time we cast a non-creature spell. And then we can also scry 2 when it enters the battlefield, which is definitely very good there. And like I was saying before, you can add things like Liverguide Pathways, the slow lands from standard if you have those. And then if you also have additional rare cards to craft, Sulphur Falls is another great land to add to the deck, as it is a land that comes in the battlefield tapped unless we control an island or a mountain. And we do have quite a few of those, so you probably cut down some of those to add in a set of those. But definitely a cool low to the ground style deck that I do think it definitely has a lot of potential to do very, very well. Definitely gets around things like Fatal Push, which is definitely kind of a prominent 1-mana removal spell for these aggro aggressive decks, because they'll have to pay 3 mana for 1-mana removal, which is definitely very good there. And it does get +1/+1 every time we cast an artifact spell. We get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, so it does get pretty big pretty quickly, as we do have a lot of cheap artifact spells. And the other card that kind of helps us dig a little bit deeper in the deck is going to be the Ignis Smith. It's a 2-mana 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, we can look at top 4 cards of our library. We can reveal artifact from among them, put into our hand, and put the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. And then whenever one or more artifacts enter the battlefield under control, it also will get +1/+1, and it only triggers once each turn. But it's another creature that will get bigger in our deck. Outside of that, I mean, like I said, we do have a balance of artifact creatures and artifact kind of like things that kind of do additional effects. We have Glass Casket here as a 2-mana artifact that enters the battlefield. We exile target creature and opponent controls mana value 3 or less. We have All That Glitters in the deck as an aura that gives target creature +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment we control. So we have 2 ways to kind of pump up creatures in our deck. We play a couple copies of Ornithopter as a 0-mana 0/2. It doesn't look like anything impressive, but it's a free artifact spell that we can play without actually having to pay any mana. And this is definitely a cool way to give itself maybe that +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment we control, and kind of fly over the top with that damage. We have Hotshot Mechanic as a 1-mana 2/1. The vehicle crewing ability doesn't really matter, but it's definitely good in the sense that it's a 1-mana 2/1 regardless. Portable Hull also makes the cut as a 1-mana artifact that we get to do the same thing kind of like Glass Casket, but we get to do it to target not only permanent opponent controls that costs 2 or less, so it's definitely good as well. Yeah, Experimental Synthesizer is a way to dig a little bit deeper in the deck, because when it comes in the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, we get to exile top of card of our library, and we can play that card until the end of our turn. And then for 3 mana, we can also sacrifice it and create a 2/2 Samurai creature token in case we need maybe a chump block or just a way to deal additional damage. Rabbit Battery is another 1-mana 1/1 cheap artifact that has haste, and then we can reconfigure given target creature haste and also +1/+1. And then we have Gingerbrute here for that little bit of evasive damage as a 1-mana 1/1 with haste that we can tap 1, and it can't be blocked this turn except by creatures with haste. So essentially, unless your opponent's playing also haste creatures, it kind of has a little bit of evasive. And we can also sacrifice and gain 3 life if we really are desperate and we're getting low on life, but we think we can finish off our opponent. And then the mana base, yet again, because it is a very cheap, low to the ground deck, we're only going with 20 lands in this deck. We have we have 4 Sacred Foundries in here, so that's kind of like the only rare in this deck. And then we have a balance of 6 mountains and 10 plains. So overall, very, very cheap, low to the ground deck that I do think you can pull off. Yet again, if you have pathways from standard, if you have, maybe the slow lands from standard, you can definitely have those until you get the Sacred Foundries and build your way towards that if you're starting out. And then in the mana base, like I kind of had before, we have a little bit more options that we can choose. So you have Beaumont Courier. It's a 1-mana 1/1 haster that whenever it attacks, we get to exile top card of our library face down. And then we can tap 1, discard our hand, and sacrifice it. And then we can put all the exiled cards with Beaumont Courier into its owner's hands. So it's definitely one of those things, if we get empty-handed, but it itself has like 2 or 3 cards underneath it, we can now sacrifice it after maybe attacking with it or something like that, and then we get to put all those cards into our hand, or maybe in response to removal we can just sacrifice it and just kind of get those cards before they get removed and exiled from the game for the rest of the game. We also have Hope Gab Wrapper. It's a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that we can sacrifice it until end of next turn. Target player who was dealt damage by Hope Gariper this turn can't cast non-creature spells. So it's kind of one of those interesting things that we can actually attack. We can either sacrifice it during our opponent's turn, we can sacrifice during our turn, and then we can pretty much prevent our opponent from casting non-creature spells, which is very good against like control decks or decks that play a lot of non-creature spells to do what they need to do, and definitely helps us out in that regard. But overall, pretty cool card that kind of works very well with the deck. We got Lizard Blade is another cool card that's from Standard, so if you play Standard you may already have copies of this. It's a 2-mana 1/1 with double strike, and then we can give target creature also double strike by reconfiguring for 2, but yet again, just a way to kind of push that damage in. If you kind of want to go the more artifact route, you can always add Steel Overseer as a 2-mana 1/1, and then we can tap it when it doesn't have Summon Sickness and give each artifact creature we control additional +1/+1. Stone Coil Serpent's very good, as well as an X costing 0/0, but it has reach, trample, and protection for multicolor, and then it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So if you have just a bunch of mana, you can sink it into a Stone Coil Serpent and get a very big creature that just eats a lot of things. You have Needle Verge Pathway, like I was saying, if you want to add those. You also have Cliff Top Retreat as a land that comes out of the battlefield untapped if we control a mountain or plains. Inspiring Village is kind of one of the fast lands, I think is what they call it. It's a land that comes out of the battlefield untapped as long as we control 2 or fewer lands. So in the early game, these lands are definitely very good as well. And then you can also add in Treasure Vault as another cool land that synergizes very well with artifacts, as it itself is an artifact land. So therefore, anything that gets pumped by having additional artifacts on will get pumped from this as well. And then we can always tap it for XX and sacrifice, and we get X Treasure Vault treasure tokens, which can also trigger those additional triggers of the artifact abilities. But yet again, another low to the ground, very aggressive deck that can hit your opponent quickly before they even know what's happened. Definitely a cool deck to check out as well for a limited budget. So the next deck up here on the list is going to be Azorius Auras. This is definitely a list that you may have seen in Historic. The one big difference that we have in our list compared to that list is we don't have Core Spirit Dancer, as that card is definitely very good, but is only limited to Historic in Arena. But we do have a version of it that we hopefully should be just fine, even though we don't play that card. The focus of this deck is to kind of put all our marbles by putting enchantments on a particular creature. That creature will get flying, so hopefully it can fly over and deal damage, and also a possibility of gaining life. And then we play things like All That Glitters that will allows us to get +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment we control. Another key thing, because we don't play Core Spirit Dancer, is how do we keep that tempo going, because Core Spirit Dancer also helps us draw. So the 2 key cards that we have in the deck that I feel like are must-haves would one be Storm Chaser Drake. So if you play Standard, you probably have copies of these, but whenever it becomes target of a spell we control, which includes Auras, we get to draw a card. And then the other card being SRAM, the Senior Edificer, a 2-mana 2/2 rare, that whenever we cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, we get to draw a card. So it itself doesn't have to get the aura on it, but it also will get allows us to kind of dig a little bit deeper and kind of keep that tempo going. But I mean, like I said, for the most part is, once you kind of get like maybe 1 or 2 creatures, you want to probably put a lot of these auras onto that one particular creature and then kind of swing in for big damage that way. The auras that we really use to do that is one is Staggering Insight. This is kind of a cool aura that gives target creature +1/+1 and also lifelink. And then also whenever this creature does combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card, keeping that hand full. All That Glitters is yet again another aura that makes the list, as it gets +1/+1 for each other artifact and aura we do control, our enchantment we control. Yeah, Adanto Vanguard is another interesting creature. It's a 2-mana 1/1. It gets +2/+0 as long as it's attacking, so it's a creature that gets more aggressive on the offensive, and then we can pay for life and give it indestructible at end of turn, so it kind of goes very well with like a Staggering Insight. Do X amount of damage, pay for life, but though you get to recoup 3 of it. We have Curious Obsession as a 1-mana enchanted creature. Enchanted creature has +1/+1 and has whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card, and at the beginning of our end step, if we didn't attack with a creature this turn, we have to sacrifice it. But typically we want to put on a creature that we know we can get in for that damage. We have Arcane Flight as a 1-mana enchant creature. Enchanted creature has +1/+1 and then flying. So yet again, just another cheap aura that we can equip onto something. Sentinel's Eyes now gives our creature that we're putting that those auras on +1/+1, and it also has Vigilance, and then we can escape it by exiling two other cards from our graveyard and then casting 1 mana to then replay it. So then giving our creature +1/+1 from the graveyard was definitely very good. Selfless Savior makes the cut as a 1-mana, a 1/1 dog that we can sacrifice and give another creature of control indestructible at end of turn. Because we are playing a deck that focuses around enchantments, target creature gets +2/+2 into end of turn, and then if it's an enchanted creature or an enchantment creature, so if the creature has enchantments on it or the creature itself is an enchantment creature, it also gains hexproof and indestructible. So this is kind of like our way to kind of hopefully not get our creature killed by like a fatal push or something like that. And we also have Cartouche of Solidarity as a 1-mana enchantment that when it enters the battlefield, we could get to create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance, and then enchanted creature then also will get +1/+1 and first strike. So the creature that we're enchanting with this will get those abilities, and then on top of it, we get a creature that has Vigilance, which can also be another good target to then also put some auras into, and then we don't have to tap to attack with it, and it can stay back at its defense. But yet again, another Lord of the Ground enchantment style deck based around the blue and white colors. And then in the mana base, we have 21 lands in this deck. It's not another deck that needs a lot of lands, but it's definitely a deck that benefits from us having X amount of extra lands out, so we can keep on keeping that tempo going, especially once we get something like a Stormchaser Drake or a SRAM out onto the battlefield. But we have 11 plains, 6 islands, and then I also added in 4 Hallowed Fountains. But yet again, if you're a standard player and you have pathways, you have the slow lands and things like that, you can definitely play those in the time being. But I would recommend also eventually crafting Hallowed Fountains as another primary source of dual mana in Explorer. Then in the sideboard, yet again, not as extensive as probably the previous deck, but a couple options that you can add into the deck is something like a Light's Paw, Emperor's Voice. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that whenever an aura enters battlefield under control, if we cast it, we can search our library for an aura card with mana value less than or equal to the aura with a different name than each aura we control, and get to put that card on the battlefield and attach it to Light's Paw. So essentially, we can cast Light's Paw and then cast an aura, and then if we don't have any aura that has the same name already out on the battlefield, we now essentially go into our graveyard or go into our library and get that card out and play it essentially for free, which is definitely very good. So if you don't have all that glitters out and you have a decent amount of other auras out, you can give this all that glitters, and all of a sudden this creature's very big for only 2 mana. Glacial Fortress is another key land that you can add to the deck if you have additional rares to craft with or eventually craft into. It comes to the battlefield untapped unless we control plains or an island. And then, like I was saying, pathways are definitely another good add to the deck, as it can filter your mana depending on what colors you need. The deck is primarily white with a splash of blue just for those other auras like the Sacred Insight, the Curious Obsession, the Arcane Flight, and then Stormchaser Drake is kind of the only creature in the deck that's blue mana costing that you can also add to the deck. So the next deck up on the list is another enchantment deck. This one's in the Selesnya color, so white-green. If you've maybe seen some things in Standard, this deck is very similar to like Selesnya Enchantments, though the benefit of us playing in Explorers, we do get access to other lands and cards that we may not have already had access to. And this is definitely a very interesting deck. One of the key cards that we do have access to that we wouldn't normally have access to, something like an All-Seeds Life Bounty. It's a 1-mana, 1/1 lifelinker creature that we can tap one, we can sacrifice and give target creature or enchantment we control protection from a color of our choice until end of turn. So in itself is definitely a good creature, and then itself also have a lifelink as another key card that we can maybe pump up and still gain chunks of life with just this. Also, we have a card, Baffling End. It's a 2-mana enchantment that enters when it enters the battlefield, exile target creature and opponent controls with mana value 3 or less. If it leaves the battlefield, target opponent creates a 3/3 green dinosaur creature with trample. The one downfall to it is if your opponent has a way to get rid of it, they get a dinosaur, but most of the time it's definitely a good spot removal spell in the 2-mana slot in the early game especially. Other than that, the deck is pretty similar to what you would see in a Selesnya Enchantment deck. You have your Hallowed Haunting here, as whenever we cast whenever we have 7 more enchantments, all our creatures have flying and vigilance, and then every time we cast an enchantment spell, we get these spirit creature tokens that have power and toughness equal to the number of spirits we control. We also have Jukai Naturalist, which makes all our auras cost 1 less. We have, the Generous Visitor as a 1-mana 1/1 that whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we get to distribute a +1/+1 counter to target creature. Commune with Spirits to dig a little bit deeper into our deck. Look at top 4, get to reveal an enchantment or a land from among them, put into our hand, the rest of the bottom of our library in any random order. Machako's Reign of Truth is also in the deck as a enchantment that works very well with what we're trying to do here by basing a deck off of enchantments. We can give target creature +1/+1 on the first 2 chapters based on how many artifacts and or enchantments we control. And then on chapter 3, we get our creature that has power and toughness based on how many artifacts and enchantments we control. Spirited Companions also on the list as that little bit of card draw. Another cool card that is something we don't have access to in Standard, but is definitely cool here, is we have this Destiny Spinner. It's a 2-mana 2/3 enchantment creature. And creatures and enchantments we controlled can't be countered. So essentially, if we're playing against like a counter magic style deck, this is kind of like a key card you want to get if you're playing against like some sort of counter magic style deck. As well as allows us to kind of play our creatures and also enchantments without the worries of them being countered. And then also we can tap 4 mana and give target land we control becomes an XX elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn, X's number of enchantments we control. And with our deck being primarily based around enchantments, the creature could be fairly big for only 4 mana. And then we also have Setessan Training in the deck as a 2-mana enchantment that whenever it enchants creatures we control, when it enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card, and enchant a creature has +1/+0 and has trample. You can also play the green rune as well if you don't want to craft this. I just kind of put it here because I completely forgot about the rune until just now as I'm talking about it. So definitely another cool little card that you can add if you want to add this instead. Wolfwallow Haven. It's another cool land that you can add to the deck. It's a 2-mana aura that we get to enchant a land, and then whenever that land is tapped for mana, its owner adds an additional green mana, so it kind of helps us ramp up. So it makes a green mana produce 2 green mana, or a white mana produce a white mana and a green mana, so we tap 1 land and pay 2 and get 2 lands out of it. But yet again, overall, a pretty cool list. Like I said, like most of these lists are pretty low to the ground. The most expensive spell being Hallowed Fountain, but the rest of the deck is all 2 mana. Mana base here is a little bit on, is around 20 lands as well. We have things that help, cheapen the lands in the deck, and we also have ways to hopefully dig and find lands in case we don't have a lot in our open hand. But we have a split here of, 4 Temple Gardens. Yet again, if you don't have them, these are definitely lands you want to craft if you're looking to play Explore in the future. Blossom and Sands here as a tap dual land that is definitely good here, as I think this deck is a little bit more balanced on white and green. So you want to have additional ways to get to either color depending on the situation, and then a balance of 6 and 6 of the green and forest and plains. Here in the sideboard, a couple cards you can think about adding. Weaver Harmony also works very well in the deck just because we can get additional triggers of by tapping it and tapping a green mana, and whenever we get to target an activated or triggered ability we control from an enchantment source, and we can choose new targets for the copy, so we get additional triggers off of any of our various things. If we want to draw an additional card of the Spirit Companion, if we want to get another All-Seed Life Bounty, protection from a particular color to end a turn, if we want to get another trigger from a Chaco or Hallowed Haunted, definitely a cool card that works there. Also gives all our enchantment creatures we control +1/+1, so buffs the team. We have Setessan Champion as another card. This card's definitely pretty good, especially if we're focused on the aura effect of the deck, as it's a 3-mana 1/3 that has an ability that whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then we get to draw cards. So over the time, depending on what enchantments we draw, this card will get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And then, like I was saying before, you can always add in the pathways if you already have those, or if you're playing Standard. But they're definitely good in this deck. And then Sunpetal Grove is another dual land you can add in the deck, as it is a land that comes out of the battlefield tapped that owns control of forests or plains. But overall, yet again, another cool enchantment aura deck that kind of plays a decent balance of cards from Standard, and then adds in a couple of older cards to kind of get it in a little bit more in line with what other people are playing in Explorer. Now, the last deck here on the list is a list that is kind of actually interesting here. It's a list I actually used to run almost back in the day, minus a few cards, but this is a Temur Elementals deck. It's a 3-color deck, but the focus here is playing a bunch of elementals and trying to get very wide on your opponent, and then combo that with a Cavalcade of Calamity, as whenever we attack with a creature with power 1 or less, Cavalcade of Calamity deals 1 damage to target creature or planeswalker. that creature is attacking. So definitely pretty cool. And you combine that with something like a Chandra's Spitfire or Chandra's Pyrelin. These are both creatures that get pumped every time we deal damage to our opponent. And then depending on how many triggers we get, we can deal a bunch of damage. This deck is yet again another deck that is very low to the ground. It's a little bit on the pricey side to get started, but it's definitely a cool list if you do have the rares available, as it is running 6 rares to start before we look about upgrades. But another couple key cards that work very well with the deck, one of them being is the Risen Reef. This card's definitely a pretty awesome elemental. It's a 3-mana 1/1, which doesn't look anything impressive, but the ability of it that is really strong is the ability that it does have that whenever it or another elemental enters the battlefield under control, we get to look at the top card of our library. If it's a land card, we can put it on the battlefield tapped. If we don't, we get put it on the battlefield. We get to put it into our hand. Which is definitely a very strong ability, as our deck is very low to the ground. And it doesn't matter if it's a creature that we physically cast, or if it's an elemental that comes in based on a token effect. So we'll get triggers based on how many of those are. And then this will help us kind of just ramp up fairly quickly. And we do have a lot of ways to get a bunch of things out on the battlefield after we play Risen Reef that will definitely just overwhelm your opponent in that regard. And if we have a bunch of mana, it will allow us to just play all our spells essentially and just kind of over our opponent by just having a bunch of small creatures on the battlefield, but they'll ping away at your opponent's life. Other than that, we just have a couple other cards we added into the deck. We have Fate and Hopes here to bounce things back that may be in our way if we want to get through for some damage, or we want to maybe in response bounce some of our creatures back in response, and we get to scry 1. We have Barge In as another interesting card here. It's a 1-mana instant that gives target attacking creature +2/+2 in end turn, and then each attacking non-human creature we control gains trample. This kind of helps out, if there's something in our way. It's not really for the pump effect, it's more so for the trample effect if we want to add it to like our Pyrelin and or Spitfire. As these things can definitely get very big, but if they just throw like a 1/1 in front of it and doesn't have trample, all that damage doesn't really mean anything. So this is kind of like our way to hopefully get around that, and it's only 1 mana. We have 4 copies of the Scorched Spitter. It's a 1-mana 1/1 that whenever it attacks, it deals 1 damage to the player and or planeswalker it's attacking. And yet again, this is another key card that combos very well with the Pyrelin and the Chandra Spitfire, as that card will trigger those abilities. We got Healer of the Glade as a 1-mana 1/2. When it enters the battlefield, we gain 3 life. So it's a 1-mana gain 3 life, and we get a creature out of it. We have Tamiyo's Safekeeping if we want to protect one of our creatures, give it indestructible and hexproof in end turn, and also gain 2 life. We have Cavalcade of Calamity as kind of the key card of the deck. It's just the card that's going to help us get those additional points of damage with our very small creatures, and then pretty much pump our Chandra, Spitfire, and Pyrelin creatures as well. Got Tangled Florahedron here as a 2-mana 1/1 elemental that also can tap for mana. Worst case scenario, we can always put it on the battlefield as a land tapped. We have Lightning Storm King as like the only creature in the deck that I'm now looking at this, and maybe I want to reconsider, but it is a 2-mana fly and haster that is also elemental and a wizard. The downfall of it is it won't trigger Cavalcade of Calamity, so it's probably one of those cards I'll probably think about replacing, but it's definitely still works very well, as it is definitely a decent aggressive creature that you can just play for 2 mana. We've had 3 copies of Chandra's Spitfire. It gets +3/+0 into end turn every time an opponent was dealt damage by non-combat damage, meaning the Cavalcade of Calamity and the Spitfire triggers. Chandra's Acolyte is 2 copies in the deck as a 3-mana planeswalker that has 2 0 abilities. That the first 0 ability gets to put a loyalty counter each red planeswalker control. So essentially we just put a counter on her. And the second ability is kind of like the key ability that she does have, is for 0 mana or for 0 loyalty. We can create 2 red elemental creature tokens. They gain haste and then sacrifice them at the beginning of our combat. So it allows us to kind of get just some free damage in with a Cavalcade of Calamity. If our opponent doesn't block, we deal 4 damage. If they do block, we deal whatever they block, and we still get at least 2 triggers of that. Also combines well with the Risen Reef, because those free elementals will then trigger the Risen Reef's ability, which allows us to dig a little bit deeper, allowing us to draw lands on the battlefield and helping us ramp up that way, as also allowing us to just draw cards from our deck, because any card that we take off the top with this, we don't actually have to reveal unless it's the land card and we want to put on the battlefield. So just a good way that triggers very well there. And the last card being the Scamping Scorcher. Is a 4-mana 1/1 that enters the battlefield. We create 2 1/1 red elemental creature tokens. Elementals we control then gain haste into end of turn. So if we do play this after playing other elementals, all our elementals will essentially gain haste, meaning they can immediately attack. And yet again, this essentially for 4 mana after playing a Risen Reef will trigger 3 triggers of Risen Reef's ability, so just helping us ramp up there. Mana base is pretty straightforward. We're kind of coming in, I think, at 22 lands, if I'm not mistaken. plus the 2 floor regions, so I think 24. So we have 4 islands, 6 mountains, 4 forests, 2 of the blue-red Swiftwater Cliffs, 2 of the red-green Rugged Highlands, and I actually included 4 Kira Triomes, as I do think because we are playing 3 lands, you want to make sure you hit your 3 colors, and the Triomes I do feel like are slightly necessary just to kind of making sure we hit that. But overall, pretty cool deck. Yet again, very low to the curve. Definitely a deck that can just overwhelm very, very quickly. Definitely a cool deck to check out. And then in the sideboard, just if you're looking for some other ways to upgrade, and this is kind of one of those things, when you upgrade the deck, you probably want to probably go up to like 28 lands and kind of cut down on some of the other things in the deck, because you want to play cards like Omnath, Locus of the Royal. It's a 4-mana elemental legendary creature that when it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to any target equal to the number of elementals you control, so you can also do it to your opponent's face. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on an elemental we control, and if we control 8 or more lands, we get to draw a card. So definitely we want to make sure we're hitting lands, and combining this with Risen Reef will definitely be very good. After that, we also have the other Omnath, the 4-mana Omnath from Zendikar Rising. When it enters the battlefield, we draw a card, and then whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we gain 4 life. If this is the first time that has resolved, if it's the second time, we add 4 mana. If it's the third time, we deal 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker we don't control. So yet again, these are probably both good reasons why you want probably like 28 lands, if not 30 lands in the deck. Cavalier Thorns is another option you could add here. It's a 5-mana 5/6 with reach. When it enters the battlefield, we will top 5 cards of our library. We get to put a land card from among them onto the battlefield and rest into our graveyard. And then whenever it dies, we may exile it. If we do, we get to put another target card from our graveyard onto the top of our library. Yet again, just another way to add some additional lands to the battlefield. Definitely not necessary, but it's definitely a decent 5-mana card that's a 5/6 and also has reach. Genesis Ultimatum is like the big finisher. If we're playing a bunch of lands, we want to have something to do with them, and this is definitely that card that's going to do something. For 7 mana, we get to look at top 5 cards of our library. We get to put any number of permanent cards from among them onto the battlefield and the rest into our hand. For the most part, we are only playing permanents, so we'll get a lot of elementals, which is definitely very good, and kind of at that point, your opponent may just scoop. And then, these are just some lands you can add in, get rid of the tap dual lands, add in some stomping grounds, some breeding pools, some steam vents, and maybe even Fabled Passage as a way to search your library for a particular color you may be lacking, as this is kind of like the only rare fetch land that you can really look for, which we could only use to search your library for lands, as I believe the fetch lands that typically exist in like Modern, they're also banned, so definitely a decent idea to add. But overall, the list is definitely pretty good. This is definitely a good place to get started, being very low to the ground and low curve and not really costing too much wild cards in the sense of rares and mythics. Definitely a cool deck to start out with if you're looking for a fun little deck that has a bunch of triggers and things like that. But with that being said, I mean, these 5 decks are definitely another interesting idea if you're looking for other decks to maybe jump into Explore with probably over the course of the next few weeks or so, as yet again kind of figure out if we're going to get a 2023 standard queue and stuff like that. I'll probably dive a little bit more into Explorer, maybe do some gameplay. As much as I understand what decks to craft, I still really don't know what other people are really playing for the most part. But yet again, if you like any of these decks and maybe try out any of these decks, let me know in the comments below how you did. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.